Welcome back to Brighter Morning with Bhoe. I am Bhoe Tiwari. Glad to have you on board. 97.5 FM Hot Like Pepper Radio and MC TV, Multicultural TV. I was just having this very enjoyable discussion with Mangal Patisa, cut short by the technical difficulties that we had, but we'll try and make up by having him on another occasion. But before we go into the next phase of our discussion, and our next guest is Mr. Jerry Besson, I want to play a short clip from Mangal playing first the sitar, and then you hear the pan from his band come in. So you hear the cacophony of instruments together, really, in this clip. It's a short clip. So there you get an idea of really this beautiful creativity and the bringing together of instruments from East and West and out of Trinidad and Tobago, because you heard the tenor pan there. And of course in Panta you have the double second as well. You have the tenor pan, you have the double second. And of course you have the bass. Guitar and other guitars and so on. So it's a wonderful celebration of music and life and diversity, and as Mangal himself was saying, social cohesion. A nice thing to remember as we approach our 59th year of independence this year. So a lot of things are happening. I just heard former Prime Minister Blair there talking about, is Jerry on the, right, okay. I just heard Prime Minister Blair there talking about the pullout in Afghanistan, and talking particularly about President Biden. And he said something very important. He said you can't base policy on a slogan. You have to base it on strategy. It is a very important thing for the politicians in Trinidad and Tobago to remember. And it's a very important thing for the government and opposition of Trinidad and Tobago to remember as well. Blair is not one of my favorite prime ministers. I had a lot of faith in him in the early days, but he lost me along the way somewhere. But still, it's important to hear what he has to say, and that Afghanistan situation and the pullout from Afghanistan is going to be with us for a long time. It has serious implications for what is going to happen to security in the world and the geopolitics of the region. Already you are seeing that China is filling the vacuum. Russia is very quiet in Afghanistan, saying very little. Russia spent 10 years as an occupying force in Afghanistan before the U.S. went. And you heard former Prime Minister Blair talking about the presence of ISIS and the likely re-emergence of Al-Qaeda as threats to the world outside of the region, and of course to the region itself too. What we have been watching there, as people have been trying to get out of Afghanistan, is the plight of those people who helped American forces when they were there as the occupying force in Taliban, and the very, very frightened state that they are in now that the Taliban is coming back to power. And I think the American people, and I want to say I spent 8 years living in the United States, 5 years I spent in Evanston and Chicago, and I spent 3 years. The second time I had my family. The first time I was a young man in undergraduate school and doing my master's. But the second time I spent it in Pennsylvania, so I spent 3 years there. And I want to commend the American people as opposed to the politicians in the country. I want to commend the American people for the tremendous empathy that they have shown for the plight of those Afghanis who were aligned to the U.S. and are fighting to get out. I think that the American people voiced their opinion very vociferously, indicating that it was a moral responsibility and obligation for the U.S. to look after them, and I think that that is likely to happen now. We weren't sure that it was going to happen before, and how many people were abandoned. I also want to commend the U.S. media on the role that it has played in turning the tide, so to speak, of sympathy for these Afghanis who are trapped there now, between a rock and a hard place, literally, with the Taliban taking power. And I hope that many, many of them are going to get out and go to safe havens in different parts of the world. But we welcome our guest now, Mr. Jerry Besson, and we talked to Jerry this morning. Thank you very much, Mr. Besson. How are you?
I'm very, very well, Bhoe. Good morning.
Yeah,
and
good
good morning
to see you.
to you as well.
You are happy. You are happy about something.
Well, I'm happy to be here this morning with you, Prof.
Very good. Very good. And so am I. You know, I know you are a person who doesn't court publicity, and you are not, you don't make yourself into a public figure, although you can't be. You can be. But you're a person who have done, you have done a tremendous amount of work and given a lot of service to this country. And in this week where we are looking at independence, past, present, and future, we are going to be 59 years on August 31st, we'll be 60 years next year. I thought it might be useful and valuable, not to mention interesting from my point of view, to talk to you on your reflections of independence. You want to start by telling me where your thoughts of independence begins. I suspect it's going to go way back, because I know you understand the history of this country very well.
Well, if you mean where I was on when independence actually took place, I was with a group of very happy people at the Perseverance Club, where there was a big party, and it was Independence Night. So that is where I was.
That's how you spent Independence Nights. Great. Okay.
With a group of friends.
What do you remember about that occasion and carry with you?
Well, what stayed with me was a sort of mixed feelings in many ways, because I was about 20 or 21 or so at the time, and there were a lot of people who could not imagine independence. They could not imagine being independent from Britain at the time. It seemed to them so strange, so almost otherworldly. And then there was such a vast amount of people, because there was a wellspring of enthusiasm that was taking place at the time, that was very for independence and very, very supportive of the independence movement. So there was, in my memory at the time, and in those days I wasn't particularly conscious of politics per se. I came away with the feeling that there was sort of mixed emotions about it.
Yes. People were uncertain about what would happen as we exited from, you might say, British guiding hand, so to speak. Yes, yes. Huh?
Sort of incubation.
Yeah.
British
yes.
incubation.
Yes. Okay. But you have an idea that, in 1783, at the time when the cellular population was established, that was the beginnings of the origins, you might say, of the culture that evolved and the ethos that emerged in Trinidad and Tobago. Could you talk to me a little bit about that?
All right, Prof. I'll give you a very brief capsule here.
Yeah, well, you have to be brief, because I know you could write a book about that.
And I mean, for me, talking to you about the history of Trinidad, I mean, this is rather like a cat looking at a king. But what I want to say is that Trinidad didn't develop in the same spirit, the same way that, say, Barbados or Jamaica did, that had a very, very old history. I mean, the European occupation of these islands go back, to the early part of the 17th century. In the case of Trinidad, what happened was that it was a completely deserted island, and then quite suddenly, from 1783 to a decade or two later, a population arrived. And these people came from all over the world. So, and in other islands, albeit they're being slave islands, basically, with sugar as the basis of their economy and colonialism and all of that, there were several generations that the society developed over time. In the case of Trinidad, people arrived here from all over the Caribbean and all over the world very suddenly. And these people came with all their points of view, their politics, their attitudes. Donald Wood, a historian, said that Trinidad was the product of the French Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars.
Yeah.
So these people came under the settler population. The European population in the 1780s was about 700 or 800 people, of which the majority were French. And the free black and colored population was about 5,000 or 6,000, going up to about 7,000 people. And these were free people who, some of them were mixed race, some of them were, well, I suppose looked like me, some were darker. But they were free people, and they had come under the terms of the cedula of population, which was a very generous piece of legislation of the time. It was a remarkable thing.
Yes.
So this was the foundation of Trinidad. The Frenchness of Trinidad didn't come from
Basically,
the...
the cellular gave people land to settle, right? And
Yeah, yeah, you
develop
had to be a
agriculture.
Catholic.
Yeah, yes.
Yeah, and the amount of slaves that you brought dictated the amount of land that you got. So this group of black and mixed race people were were on the cutting edge of the agricultural development together with the Europeans as well. Most of them settled around the Naparimas, north and south. The British now accepted the terms of the cedula, which meant a lot to these people. The Frenchness of Trinidad didn't come from the few hundred Europeans, French, who were here. It really came from the 7,000 or 8,000 people who had come from Grenada, St. Lucia, Dominica. So this was the beginning of the Creole society, so to speak. There was an attempt to deprive them of their rights under Governor Woodford. And this group of people produced a remarkable individual called Jean-Baptiste Philippe, who took the case to the law lords in Britain. And I think he accomplished the first civil rights case in the Western world. And in so doing, the free black and colored people of Trinidad had the same rights and privileges under British law as Europeans. Now, this gave Trinidad a foundation to create a middle class, a colored, black and colored middle class. This is the beginning of the Creole culture, so to speak, Bhoe. This is ground zero, so to speak. This is long, long before the Indians came. This is about 30 odd years before the arrival of the first indentured Indians. So this is the beginning of Creole Trinidad.
Yes.
It produced a middle class. It produced an intelligentsia. It produced a professional class. It had a impulse in the 1850s under people like J.J. Thomas, the educator, who actually created a Creole grammar, a patois grammar. Pierre Gustave Borde wrote a history of Trinidad in French. It produced over the next generation or so a lot of very interesting people like Padmore and C.L.R. James, and ultimately Eric Williams, who took us into independence. So this is the origin, and I suppose, if you like, the social progress of the Creole culture of Trinidad.
Okay, the history of enslavement in Trinidad and Tobago is not a long history, is it?
No, the history of enslavement in Trinidad, actual enslaved people in Trinidad, was only about 50 years.
Yes.
And because of that, and I suppose an urge to apologize for it, there's this mistaken notion that slavery in Trinidad was somehow benign or paternalistic or something. Is completely untrue.
Yes.
Slavery was slavery throughout the Caribbean, whether it lasted 200 years, as in the case of Jamaica, or 50 years in the case of Trinidad. As a matter of fact, in Trinidad, during the 1820s, when emancipation was close, reports appeared in London, in the newspapers in England, about the severity of slavery in Trinidad. So the notion of it being a sort of benign paternalistic experience, well, That's fairy tales.
Yeah, well, I mean, slavery was brutal everywhere, and
Yes.
perhaps, well, what can I say? It's hard to compare, but it was severe and brutal everywhere. And after emancipation, of course, you had the free coloreds many years before, helping to form the ethos of that society, what you call Creole society. You had the planter class, of course, who were basically French Creoles. And you then had the movement, after emancipation, you had the new immigration, relatively, which would be the Portuguese, the Chinese, the Indians in large numbers, but the Portuguese in small numbers before, Chinese in smaller numbers. Then you had the Indians. And basically, we have been wrestling with the formation of a society ever since, right? Do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Well, first off, I want to tell you that the French planter class, which you must always remember was only perhaps 12 families, 15 families, numbering no more than about 700 people, was small. The free-colored planter class was also small. By emancipation, both those groups were effectively out of business. The real planter class of Trinidad was, of course, the British planter class that took over the lands that were cleared by the original settlers, those two groups that we've just talked about.
Yes.
And big operations like Tennant, big operations like Cadbury, big operations like the forerunners of Brecon Castle, and so these were the British. People like Burnley and Eccles, Selwyn Cudjoe wrote a very good book about Burnley.
Yes.
That was the significant planter class.
Yes.
The French Creoles did not get back into agriculture until the 1870s, with the cocoa boom that went from the 1870s into the, well, I suppose you could say the 1930s, 1940s, or even 50s, before cocoa came to an end together with the agricultural sector on the whole. Actually, I forgot the question that you asked last.
No, I'm talking about the evolution of the society with the coming in, well, first of all, with the establishment of the Emancipation Proclamation, which means that you now had a lot of formerly enslaved people now free, and then you had the beginning of indenture with Portuguese, Chinese, and large numbers of Indians, and the evolution of the society.
Right,
Okay.
Well, you just got me back on track.
Yeah.
According to what a lot of historians have written, it wouldn't appear that England intended that Trinidad would become a slave colony in the same sense that Barbados was. Prime Minister Canning described Trinidad as an experimental colony, and I suppose in many ways it still is. So they experimented with small groups of people like the Chinese. It wasn't a very successful experiment. Then around the 1840s, they experimented again with Portuguese. And all of these were attempts to bring people into the agricultural sector. And then, well, of course, the breathtaking piece of social engineering that was conducted by the British government was really the transportation of some 120,000 or 117,000 people out of the subcontinent of India to the Caribbean, mostly to Trinidad and to Guyana. That changed the equation of the Creole culture, of the trajectory of the Creole culture. But mostly the Indian people who came incrementally in small quantities from 1845 to 1917 did not really impact upon the Creole culture per se, because of isolation.
Yeah,
that was contrived to a considerable extent, that even when Indians served their terms of indentureship, there were all sorts of encouragement and pressure put upon them to stay upon the estates or stay close to the estates. So the Creole culture grew and developed quite separately from what was taking place in the plains of Caroni and in other places in the south where the sugar industry, Tate and Lyle and all of that was really booming away. There were two economies developing in the 19th century. One was, of course, the sugar economy, which was a rich man's affair. And then the cocoa economy, which started in Trinidad largely because of Trinidad having a very pungent, very high quality cocoa that coincided with the development of chocolate. And a cocoa economy began to develop. Now, the cocoa economy was a real trickle-down economy, in that there were a lot of French Creole people who had estates. I think in the 1,000 estates that were under cocoa in 1900, French Creoles controlled about 129 of those estates or something like that. The rest were owned by small farmers, small cocoa planters. So it was both a wealthy people's economy and a poorer person's economy. So it was really a trickle-down economy, that ordinary people made money out of cocoa. This is where the pretty little gingerbread houses of Woodbrook and Belmont and in San Fernando, around Paradise Estate down there began to come into existence. And the cocoa economy generated a tremendous amount of small firms who exported produce and imported various consumer durables, galvanized nails, paint, all kind of thing. And this led to a lot of clerking, because they had no typewriters or anything like that, computers, so everybody had to sit at their desk writing into ledgers. So the middle class developed in Trinidad partly as a result of the core of the free black and colored people, who were about 11,000 strong in the 1830s. They were buttressed by the 20,000 odd enslaved people who gained their emancipation. And over time, these two groups blended into each other, and out of this forms the Creole middle class. Now, what I want to add here is that there was always a sense of resistance to British rule. It had to do with these people coming from islands where there was a very strong Republican influence. And with the takeover by the British in the 1790s, there was always a sense of being occupied by the British. So there was a resistance movement that expressed itself in the underclass of this group. This is the free colored people and the formerly enslaved people. What developed was something called the Jamet class. Out of this came Canboulay, out of this came Kalinda, out of this came Calypso, out of this ultimately came Steelman. All of this was a resistance, an impulse to resist, and from time to time, the rebel leader would emerge out of this resistance movement that was a sort of undercurrent that ran through the colonial society that the British felt that they had to control.
Yes, and
that was a long speech, Bhoe.
No, I'm following you because that takes us that current of resistance, out of which came these very, very powerful cultural creations, also manifested itself, for instance, in the what you might call in the rebellion of, let's say, labor in the 1930s, and perhaps also the resistance of the Baptists for their own sense of authenticity in Trinidad and Tobago's cultural history, not so?
Well, in the case of the labor movement, it was inevitable. Whether or not there was a incipient and inherent resistant movement in Trinidad. After the First World War, where several hundred Trinidadians served on the Western Front, in East Africa, in Egypt, in Palestine. The magic around the notion of white supremacy was broken, because what black Trinidadian soldiers saw was English men, European men, in roles where they were not managers, they were not overseers, they were not bosses. They saw them as ordinary people. And the terror of the trenches is a great equalizer.
Yes,
so by the time these men came back to Trinidad, the myth of white supremacy had been completely broken. And then the period right after the war, the knowledge of and the basic spread of information concerning the labor movement and concerning the overall socialist impulse that was taking place all over the world brought about a sort of invigorating of the Working Man's Association that had been started by Cipriani and these fellas before. So people like Rojas and people like Cola Rienzi and Butler and so, they drove the impulse forward. And of course it gained a lot of traction because of the inherent feeling for resistance that had been part and parcel of the culture of Trinidad.
Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
Well, what I was just going to add is that it was a very necessary thing to happen, because the way that the society actually was at the time, was that in the 1920s, and this is the 1920s going forward to the 1930s that we're talking about, was a time when there was a collapse in the cocoa economy, there was a collapse in the sugar economy, and the working people of Trinidad were suffering in very, very real terms. I mean, if you could imagine people all over Trinidad, all about the place, I mean, actually in starvation. I mean, it was, and living conditions in Port of Spain, living conditions throughout the cane districts, in the deep south where the oil was, people were living in close to barbaric conditions.
Yeah.
So the labor movement that was driven by those stalwarts, by those patriots, you can call them, was a very, very necessary impulse to deal with not only colonial prejudice, but also to deal with the dreadful economic situation that people were living under. I mean, 99% of the population was poor.
Yes, of course.
I mean, even respectable people,
yes.
even white people, all kind of thing. Poor, yeah. I mean, real poor, I mean, you know.
So, well, I took you to the 30s because we would get to the 20s with Cipriani. You'd come to the end of indenture in 1920. You'd have the resistance manifesting itself among workers and the emergence of people like Rienzi and Cipriani first, and then Rienzi and Butler. But you also had an intellectual ferment in the 1930s that led to the beginnings, you might say, of our literature during the time of Albert Gomes, C.L.R. James, all of these people also beginning to write, the beacon being formed, so that the ferment and the search in the society to find a way, all right, was something that became very, very manifest on the foundations laid in the early days from 1783 now on, became very manifest in the 1920s, but especially in the 1930s, not so?
Well, quite so. Okay. You have to get ready for another long speech, Bhoe.
Okay, don't make it too long because I want to ask you some things about yourself, and we could always talk again. No, we can always talk again, but we have to break for the news in a few minutes. So make it sharp and pointed, and I'll ask you a couple questions about yourself.
Okay. Well, what you're talking about is the new beacon movement of the 1930s and 40s.
Yeah.
So, well, it didn't start quite abruptly at that point in time.
Yes, of course.
It really comes out of the fact that the free black and colored people, as far back as the 1820s, were beginning to produce very, very slowly, very limitedly, university-educated people. There were at first 3 or 4 doctors in the 1820s, 1830s, and then gradually there were some who became solicitors, lawyers, and then eventually educators. Now, the educators that began to emerge in the 1850s, 1860s, these are the famous school teachers who knew very well that the only way to deal with British colonialism of the day was education. And out of that, in the period after the First World War, you could say that an intellectual nucleus began to be formed around people like Mendes, people like CLR, people like Albert Gomes, People like Raoul Pantin's father, who wrote for the Beacon, Gertrude Craig, a lot of people began to sort of find a voice to express in poetry and in literature and in talking in the debating clubs, and of which there were many, many expressions that had to do with a perhaps more refined notion, a more refined idea of resistance.
Yes. Okay. I want to ask you a couple things about yourself now. I know we've come on the cusp of the thing, which is the rise of the national movement with Eric Williams in a diverse society. And ultimately, between 1956 and 62, the urge, first of all, for federation and then eventually national independence. But I want to ask you something. You grew up in Belmont, right?
Yeah.
All right. So you grew up in Belmont. You had that sensibility. One of the things I remember from being a schoolboy in QRC was how many people from Belmont were my classmates and schoolmates in QRC. And secondly, how proud people were about Belmont as a community in which they grew up. And it was a very multi-ethnic group coming out of Belmont. Tell me a little bit about that. And you have to be sharp and short.
Yeah, I'm going to be sharp and short as I can. And you have to bear in mind that I'm talking about my hometown.
Yes, I know that.
Belmont was in fact the first suburb of Port of Spain. It extended really and truly from you could say from the Hilton Hotel all the way down to Besson Street.
Yeah.
All of that was East Port of Spain.
Yes.
It was very, very multicultural. It was very, very multiracial. It was, in fact, the whole catchment area of the Creole culture. And you could say the Jamet Society was born in East Port of Spain, behind the bridge.
Yes.
Because Belmont is behind the bridge.
Yes.
And behind the bridge in those days, and up until not too long ago, and I think it's, well, until the present day, has a certain sort of cachet to it on the one hand, and on the other, very undeserved sort of stigma. But essentially, because it was so multiracial, and they had a lot of Indian people living in Belmont, and there was a lot of black and colored people living in Belmont, and the notion of respectability was top of mind, because this is another factor that sort of parallels resistance, was respectability. The pursuit of respectability led to a lot of piano playing and violin lessons and all that sort of stuff. So a lot of music came out of Belmont.
Yeah.
Because of Carnival being a child of this culture, a lot of great mass men and great Carnival mass came out of Trinidad, especially in the early 40s, people like Harold Saldina and others. And of course, the whole steel band movement came out of East Port of Spain.
Yes.
Ranging from white boy bands like Dixieland,
yes,
to Casablanca, to Desperados, Renegades. All of that was the East. A good old champion of the East died very recently, Leroy Clark.
Yes.
Yeah. He portrayed in his work, in his writing, in his paintings, and so a lot of the deep feelings for his African roots very, very evident, very spectacularly portrayed in his paintings, very soulfully depicted in his poetry and his other writing. And then there were a whole lot of other people, like, what's his name, Ken something, the fella who did a lot of metal work, and many, many others. Now their names are forgotten, and you could say that Belmont was a deeply cultural place.
Yes, it
that
was.
really shaped to a considerable extent the Trinidad Creole culture.
It was cultural, it was intellectual, it was social, I think.
And it was also political, eh?
Very political because it was intellectual and cultural and tied to the concept of resistance from the nation to the colonial order.
And there are parts.
It was
and there are parts of Belmont. It was a ferment, and there are parts of Belmont where every aspiring political party that has come into existence since independence must go and stand up and talk at some point in time. Belmont has several. East Port of Spain has several hearts.
Yes.
Okay. And you have to go there and stand up and talk.
All right, we have to close this up, but I hope I would get a yes to my invitation to come back and talk again so we could continue this conversation, because we only got to a certain point of the history. We haven't even come to the years leading up to independence yet. But before we go, I want to ask you, because I know that you are a very optimistic and hopeful person, in spite of all the problems that we are seeing now in Trinidad and Tobago, what gives you hope for the future of Trinidad and Tobago?
Oh, us, the people.
Yes.
The people. This last year and a half, I would say, has demonstrated the extent to which Trinidadians, and I'm not talking about the sort of lunatic fringe, I'm talking about the heart and soul of Trinidad on the whole, have behaved very, very very responsible under this last year and a half, 2 years now. And I would say that the government and its institutions have also behaved very responsibly, and especially the health sector as an institution has risen to the occasion in a remarkable way. And this gives you, well, more than hope, you know, this gives you a bright vision of the future, because we have done, knock wood, we have done well in a difficult situation economically, and also, well, the horrors of COVID.
Yes.
We have done very well, all things together. I mean, it could have been a lot worse. The cat could have really got out of the bag.
All right. I want to thank you for contributing this morning. I hope that you'll come back and we can have another discussion. This has been really wonderful and exhilarating. And I thank you very much, Jerry Besson. People hardly know how much work that you've done, but I'm going to put up now the 2 sets of books, which represents only a small part of what you've been able to contribute to Trinidad and Tobago. These are all books out of Paria Publishing, spanning a whole range of areas. And this is part of your contribution to Trinidad and Tobago. So we'll have you on again to talk with us about all kinds of things having to do with development.
Thank you very much.
Okay. So thank you very much for watching and listening. We're glad that you were part of this wonderful, wonderful program with 2 very, very inspiring people, Jerry Besson and Mangal Patisar. And tomorrow we will have Dr. Hamid Ghani and Mr. Kevin Baldeusing to continue the discussion on the same issues, but I'm sure with very, very different perspectives. Thank you very much for watching. This is Brighter Morning with Bhoe. We go on to Andrew Chan and the news.